that is what Tyson is doing here, then it sends the signal that those advocates are winning, right? That they are pushing the American consumer toward a more plant-based diet.
Welcome to episode 2 of the Barron Report. I'm your host, Paul Barron. And for the first-time listener, the Barron Report is designed to help restaurant operators connect the dots, read between the lines, and hopefully build innovative strategies. We hope to open your eyes to the full vision of the restaurant and hospitality industry. And for more extended insights, make sure and visit us over at foodabletv.com. Our first couple of episodes on the Barron Report are dedicated to the future of food. Today we have Helena Bottemiller Evich, a senior food and agriculture reporter from POLITICO. Helena, thank you for stopping in today.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
So our topic today, of course, is going to be future food. Future food has been kind of an aspect. We've had this as a major topic in one of our events called Foodable I.O., which talks about, it's an event that kind of goes down the track of where the industry is moving. You get a chance to really write about content like this on an ongoing basis there at POLITICO. So we really thought you would be a great insight to kind of talk about that. And really, before we get too far into this, when you think future food and the way POLITICO is covering this, what are some of the things that you guys are trying to do as a media organization around the topic of food?
It's an interesting question because I think the food space, food and agriculture, is in such a moment of change and kind of flux that there's so many different angles to come at this. I mean, we have so much conversation around improving nutrition, improving our, whether it's carbon footprint around food. For the last 4 or 5 years, this kind of conversation has kicked into the mainstream a lot more. You'll actually see consumers reading about these issues or becoming a little bit more well-versed on them, which is really interesting. But as far as food tech and kind of what's next, it seems like the kind of overarching theme right now we're seeing is this move toward trying to innovate around plant-based protein alternatives and doing more around maybe replacing some of our protein options. And that seems to be kind of where more the buzz is at the current moment. But from my perspective, being in Washington, I think the kind of theme that we're seeing here is that Washington and policy is moving just so much more slowly than the private sector is in this space. So in many ways, the excitement and the sort of fast pace is very much outside of Washington, and Washington tends to be very behind. So that's kind of my perspective on it.
Well, and especially as we've been monitoring the space, what we're finding is that there's several new media companies out there that have really started to spin off into a food category. Of course, you guys have been doing it for some time.
Yes.
But I think where this really flows into is that it's now mainstream. Food tech and kind of the future food in the past was really kind of at these conferences that were not kind of off the beaten track, and usually by scientists and or PhDs that were exploring opportunities. But now we're actually seeing this in mainstream media, and like you said, to where consumers are really kind of tying into this whole aspect of what the future of our food system is going to look like.
Totally, yeah.
So definitely on track there.
Yeah, it's gone beyond the foodies and the scientists and the ag researchers.
Exactly.
And kind of become this fascinating area. And I think part of it, too, is that, there's been so much focus, culturally and economically, on Silicon Valley and what Silicon Valley is doing for, tech more broadly. Mm-hmm. And it seems like food has sort of gotten wrapped into that more tech venture capital discussion really only in the last few years.
Right.
And so it's sort of like the new wave of, tech conversation in that context. So I think that's what makes it interesting to people, that it's sort of a new topic to talk about.
Right. One of the companies that I think for most people in the industry may recognize this company's name completely separate than any other thing that they've ever been involved before. This is something completely new, and that's Tyson Foods, who has put in $150 million into a venture capital fund to essentially back food and ag startups. So when you have a company like Tyson, a multi-billion dollar brand here that's really taking a huge initiative, moving into this direction, what are you guys seeing there at Politico of how and what types of trends are moving around companies like this as they start to explore alternatives?
I think the Tyson venture fund really got people interested and really stopped people in their tracks. Not just because Tyson is you mentioned everyone's heard of it. It's such a conventional, traditional brand, and it's also a major corporate part of the very efficient agriculture system we have. They do just so much protein and a lot of food service that even consumers aren't aware of. They're probably interacting with Tyson.
Mm-hmm.
And so for them to branch out into this, what's still considered a niche, and put down, $150 million to explore and, make some investments, is really interesting in and of itself. But then what got people even more interested was that they took, I think it was a 5% stake in Beyond Meat, which is, of course, a plant-based meat company that is very much trying to change the way people consume meat, really trying to get people to consume less meat. So I think that particular investment really caught people's attention. And we got a lot of emails about, what is this about? What are they doing? And I think more broadly, these large food and agriculture companies looking to get more involved in venture capital, I think it really stems from obviously the desire to find growth. A lot of these companies are trying to figure out how to reorient themselves to shifting consumer preferences in a way that allows them to still grow as much as they can. A lot of them are publicly traded and they need to be returning value to their shareholders. So looking for growth can be tough. You have to get creative, and Campbell's is doing the same thing. They have their own fund, and I think it's fair to assume we'll see more of this.
Well, one of the things that TechCrunch wrote about in the coverage of the Tyson piece, obviously, was the Oxford research, which I thought was kind of interesting. And to your point, predominantly a protein company known for protein in Tyson Chicken, that was really kind of initiating funds into companies that were exploring alternatives to that. And their research was to the point of, 8 million lives, by 2050 being, really affected by just reducing greenhouse gas emissions and switching diets that rely less on meat and more on fruit and vegetables. So do you think this is more of a long-term play or long-tail play on Tyson's behalf that is a shift in the process of what potentially could be the food supply in the next 20 years, much like the energy business going to alternative fuels? Do you feel like Tyson's just making an early bet here that kind of puts them out in front of most of their competitors?
Well, that's certainly what some in this space think, and I think certainly the people who are promoting a vegan diet and want to reduce meat consumption are hoping that is what Tyson is ultimately doing. If that is what Tyson is doing here, then it sends the signal that those advocates are winning, right? That they are pushing the American consumer toward a more plant-based diet. I think it remains to be seen whether or not whether plant-based meats really are the future. Certainly those companies are getting a lot of buzz and a lot of excitement in their production, and they're, selling it, and some of them are going in the meat counters at Whole Foods, and there's a lot of expansion happening. But Americans are still eating a ton of meat, just a ton. So, and I don't know that meat consumption has even really gone down recently. So, it might be kind of a way to diversify, right? And look to the future and have more, more options and more growth areas. But, it'd be really interesting to see some of the consumer or market research that Tyson had, looked at going into this. I'd be fascinated to see that.
Well, and of course, you look at some of the aspects of what they're faced with in building their brand. Obviously, alternative revenue centers that could be developed with some of these pretty innovative startups in a lot of different areas, not necessarily just in like what they've done with Beyond Meat, but also in other areas of food, whether it's farming technology and ag tech that really could maybe even improve protein production. Much like what we've seen with some of the alternative fuels research that's been going on. So I definitely, it was kind of interesting to see a major company like this that is a supplier to the industry take a really giant leap toward kind of innovation as a whole. To move into a major city like Chicago specifically for this is pretty cool.
I imagine there's a feeling of like not wanting to get left behind, right? If they see all this change and all this flux in the market, and it's hard to grow and appeal to this changing consumer taste. And I wonder if there's this feeling of like, the more we can get out there and really experiment and get behind some of these new innovations, the better positioned, I guess, they'll be going forward.
Absolutely. All right, so we're going to take a break now and thank one of our sponsors here on the Barron Report, and that is the Catering Institute, which provides training and consulting services to multi-unit restaurants and food service operators. They use a 5-pillar strategic framework: workshops, certification, experts in takeout, delivery, and catering. The Catering Institute gives executives, managers, and frontline teams the tools to plan, build, and execute successful off-premise programs. If you want to learn more about the Catering Institute, just visit them at www.cateringinstitute.com to learn more. I want to thank them so much for sponsoring the Barron Report. Let's get back to the show. Okay, well, let's kind of roll into a couple of other companies I wanted to review with you. One, of course, is a company called Seed to Growth, which is S2G Ventures. I love their tagline too, which is like, we take soil to the shelf, which is interesting. As you look at companies like what they're doing, this particular venture growth company is really starting to look at kind of the whole process issue, whether it's agriculture all the way down into ingredients, infrastructure, logistics. They've got a whole slew of stuff that they're really looking at, from when you go to their website. Here's the interesting thing to me. So we've seen this in Silicon Valley, where we've had, venture capital groups that are popping up left and right. Then we had, this dynamic surge of investment capital, private equity, et cetera, that came available to the fast casual segment. Now you've got these companies that are really kind of, propagating their ideas and their missions out to food tech, food startups overall. Do you think that's going to create a better frenzy on the side of the entrepreneur? Or do you feel like this is going to just open up an opportunity for them to educate more, meaning the venture groups, whether it's Tyson or S2G, for them to say, hey, there's some potential funding here, so we need more innovators. Do you think we could see a lot more people rush to this market?
That's a really good question. I'm not as familiar with, how waves of venture capital have gone in other industries, but it feels like there's been such an increase in the amount of capital available that naturally there's going to be more, companies interested in taking advantage of that. But I'm not sure if there will be this like massive, influx of new entrepreneurs in this space because of the capital. I mean, I think we've seen so much growth in like the, so-called natural food space, organic space for really several years now. It's been sustained. It's been, the fastest growing part of the food industry. In some cases, it's like the only part of the food industry that's growing at a pretty substantial rate. So you would think that more capital would attract more entrepreneurs, but I'm not sure. I think maybe there's just so many out there floating already. I mean, there's so many tiny food companies. If anyone's ever been to have you ever been to Expo West or Expo East?
Mm-hmm. Right.
It's like, I mean, you can't even explain the number of small and medium-sized food companies at that event. It's so massive. You have to go and see it for yourself.
I had a chance to, kind of see the fast casual space evolve from this, so it was all the way back into early 2000s and even into the period in which we had the economic downturn in 2007. And at that time, there wasn't a lot of private equity or venture funding available to fast casual operators, but yet they were kind of innovating, and there was a spur of innovation that was kind of setting the seed to the market that was already in place. But actually, when we started seeing innovation around 2010, 2011 in venture capital, the acceleration of brands in the fast casual segment was pretty significant. So the entrepreneurs were out there and they were kind of, toiling around with their ideas and so on, but they
weren't scaling up.
Right.
Yeah.
They just weren't necessarily moving. And when you look at SUG's ventures roster, I was just kind of scanning through this, which also has Beyond Meat on it.
Yes,
But
I noticed that. Yeah.
Yeah, you've got Good Eggs on there, Terramera. You've got Mycotech, even Sweet Green, which is a concept there in DC.
Yeah.
Ripple, Prairie Brands, etc. So it doesn't. It could be that we're in an interesting honeymoon phase here with these companies, but if we see a ton of SUG type ventures, Tyson, and the next one we're going to talk about, kind of entering this space, I just wonder. Because when you go to an Expo East or an Expo West type concept, they're mostly mom and pop producers. Mm-hmm. They're not necessarily trying to change the food system. They're just maximizing on something unique in terms of their product.
Yeah. The gluten-free, dairy-free,
right?
Soy-free. It's the free-froms. That's like the boom there. Yes.
Yeah, where each one of these, at least on the Tyson approach, the S2Gs, they seem to be taking a really big bet on the true innovators, which feels to me a lot like the early ages of both Silicon Valley and even the fast casual segment when people were betting on, the Chipotles of the world and the Sweet Greens of the world.
Yeah.
They were kind of moving on. So that's kind of interesting to look at that as we continue to see these companies' growth. Now you go past, Seed to Grow and on to Cultivian Sandbox. This is the last company I wanted to kind of pick your brain on. These guys seem like they're truly after, ag tech.
Yeah.
And to me, I'm born on a farm, raised on a farm, got a chance to see a lot of this stuff up close in terms of what agriculture and the future of farming would be when you look at it. Do you feel like there is a lot of emphasis, at least in DC or as you're doing reporting around the industry, back onto the farm community?
It's such a good question because I think in general, ag tech is so ignored for how important it is. I mean, people just aren't thinking about it, right? They're going to think about the new innovation on their iPhone well before they're going to be thinking how cool it is that drones can fly over, fields and tell you exactly how much moisture is on each square foot and how much fertilizer each inch of it needs or doesn't need. But I think so consumers are definitely, and I would include news consumers in that, are generally less connected to agriculture tech. But I think the policy wonks are pretty familiar with some of the innovation that's happening and what that could mean. And in general, going back to DC just being so behind, there is a feeling of and there's a conversation really starting to happen about how do we make sure that USDA and FDA understand these new waves of technology coming, whether it's on the farm or whether it's, a robot delivering your food. How are they understanding the implications for all of these things and not getting in the way, but also making sure that consumers are protected? And I think there's going to be an interesting conversation going forward. I mean, we've got everything from like gene editing is going to be an incredibly powerful, but then also, there are some big questions about how that should or shouldn't be used. And so when I looked at Cultivian Sandbox, actually, I had not heard of several of the companies that they invest in. And that's, I think, because a lot of these companies are really more geared towards like on-farm innovation technology. And there's a huge market for disrupting that, any of those production techniques. I mean, there's a ton of money in farming. So if they can do things in a way that improve operations for farmers or make it so that they can buy fewer inputs, there's going to be a ton of upside there. And, they seem to definitely have a much more of a focus on that versus, sweet green. I'd put sweet green in a very different category, obviously. So, and sweet green is something, especially people here in DC are familiar with because it started here. But
right. Well, definitely, I think it's refreshing to see the, kind of the landscape in general really starting to shift. We had a chance, and we've fortunately here at Foodable, we've had a chance to see many of these trends start to pop up. And, it was one of the reasons that we launched and have launched several shows that kind of, groom themselves around covering those types of topics. So it's been refreshing to see this number of companies really putting a lot of effort, and seems to be some pretty serious, not only dollars, but minds behind, helping this industry kind of move to the next level. So definitely a great conversation today with you, Helena, on these topics as we continue to explore. If people want to read more of your material, where's the best place they can find your stuff?
Well, you can find me on Twitter, and my handle is @Bottemiller. I tweet about all things food and agriculture there. And then you can find, everyone should subscribe. If you're interested in food, you can Google Morning Agriculture, and we have a great daily email that goes out with a bunch of food and ag policy.
Very nice. Very cool. We'll have those items also in the show notes for everyone, so you'll be able to get access to those as this episode goes live pretty quickly here on Foodable Network. And again, also we have some other podcasts that are going to be airing very quickly here on the network, and we'll be releasing those shows and a little bit more about them coming soon in some of our editorial coverage. Also, lastly, if you have not had a chance to learn a little bit about Foodable.io, which is Foodable.io, our event in Chicago on May 19th. And that, of course, we have the topic Future Food there at the event, and we'll be talking with a lot of innovators like what Helena and I have discussed today here on the show. So if you haven't had a chance to ever come to a Foodable.io, it's kind of part education and part film festival, all rolled up into the restaurant and hospitality industry. So kind of cool. If you have a great show idea, of course, you can reach out to me on Twitter or email me, producer@foodabletv.com. Make sure and pick up this show wherever you get your podcast, whether it's iTunes, Stitcher, or right here on foodabletv.com.